Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's April 11th, 2026. I'm Ness, and I'm going to be flying solo today, and I'm going to be flying all over the place. So we'll dispense with the pleasantries and get right into it. First, the Western world in general, and the United States in particular, is set up with three major pillars of what liberal democracies aspire to. Those are liberty, equality, and diversity. Those are the things the Western world champions, and yet those three things are inherently at odds with one another. There is an irresolvable tension there that lies between those three ideas. Liberty, to have freedom, the freedom of movement, the freedom of expression, the freedom of association, all of these things, if this is allowed to flourish, well, there will not be equality. In fact, there will be very disparate outcomes on a whole host of measures, whether it be economic success, personal happiness, social status, popularity, access to physical locations and things. All the criticisms that are leveled at the free market system and the marketplace of ideas, that even without crony capitalism or special pleading or insider information, the things that we are all familiar with of criticisms that are leveled against liberal capitalism. Even without those things, if it really is a fair and level playing field, where consumer choice is the ultimate arbiter of what succeeds and what doesn't, even in that situation, there will not be anything close to equality. And on the social side of things, allowing people the liberty to have a freedom of association and freedom of movement means, as we have seen time and time again, that people will choose to live in exclusive groups that will be characterized by a host of identitarian factors, whether it be race or ethnicity or religion or socioeconomic status, occupation, even things like lifestyle, preferring a rural versus a suburban versus an urban existence. And so giving people freedom will inevitably result in a perpetual move away from diversity. Now, there will be some pockets of genuine racial and religious and economic diversity, as there are people who have a predilection for that sort of cosmopolitan, deracinated existence, but the numbers will be few and will tend to skew younger and will tend not to last long for most individuals. Diversity, as we use it in the vernacular sense in the 21st century, is a young person's game. And we see with the rise of remote networking, remote working, and the progress of artificial intelligence that much of the tendency towards moving in diverse places, which are primarily in the Western world, urban areas, is something that was fueled in the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century, in large part by economic opportunity, by perceived economic necessity. A lot of people who went to the big city to make their way in the world did so because they felt that there were a lack of economic opportunities at home. But as the ability to work anywhere has expanded, there has been a move out of the major urban areas in much of the Western world. And that is because people tend to, especially as they become older and more economically established and want to create roots and a legacy, a posterity, tend to want to get away from diversity. So we've already talked about how liberty and equality, and when we use the term equality, maybe the better term, the more accurate term to use would be equity. That is the political left in the Western world. When they speak of equality, what they're really getting at is equity. They're not just talking about autonomy, which is the idea of equality under the law, where the law is blind and it looks at each person as an individual and doesn't take any other societal factors into account and doesn't worry about the equality of outcomes, but just really exists to protect negative rights, that is, to protect people from persecution and explicit exploitation. They're not just talking about some abstract idea of equality of opportunity. They are bringing grievances against any disparities in outcomes. If one person has more money, or if one person has greater educational credentials, or if one person is taller or better looking, all of these different things are perceived in this equalist worldview to be inherently problematic. Things that are, by their very nature, problems to be solved, to be ameliorated. And that is, of course, the antithesis of liberty, of personal freedom, because if people are allowed to have the freedom to flourish and become the greatest versions of what they are, or even just order their preferences in a certain way that is at odds with how other people order their own personal preferences, well, of course, there's going to be enormous and cascading differences in outcomes. If Orange Kid has the freedom to make his way through the modern cursus honorum and achieve the educational credentials, going to college and then obtaining his master's, post-secondary education, getting a doctorate, and accumulating a bunch of debt in the process, and that despite all of those credentials is unable to provide any value in his chosen field of engineering, while Apple Kid, who dropped out of high school and went the Bill Gates route of making creations in his garage that revolutionized the world and became a multi-millionaire, billionaire as a consequence, well, the liberty of each of these individuals to follow separate paths led to enormous differences in outcomes. We've already talked about, too, how diversity and liberty are inherently at odds, because if people are given the freedom to associate with who they want to associate, and many of them most, people will choose to associate with people like themselves and live around people like themselves and create communities that are good for people like themselves and bad for people who are not like themselves. And though Westerners come in for the most criticism for this, especially people of Northwestern European descent, as we've found, as we look at the World Values Survey, which is an international survey that's had multiple waves over several decades that looks at respondents from countries all over the world, what we see is, in fact, white people are the most amenable to diversity, the least likely to say that they don't want someone of a different race as neighbors. If we look at places in Africa or in Asia, there are outright majorities who say they do not want someone of a different race or a different religion living by them. And so even in the Western enlightened world where diversity is inherently believed to have the most value, at least in terms of how people express the way they want to live their lives, even in that where the situation is the most amenable for diversity, even then, most people spend most of their time and effort trying to get away from diversity. And to achieve diversity requires inherently coercing people into doing things that, given personal liberty, given freedom, they consistently and repeatedly show that they don't want to do, that they don't want to have any part of. And perhaps most obviously, equality and diversity are most obviously at odds, because the differences in predilections that we talked about at the individual level, well, those are exponentially more powerful when you talk about the level of group identity, like ethnicity or religion. To take a really obvious example, you take a population of Muslims that believe in the idea of women staying home to run the household while the father goes out to earn a living, and fertility is perceived as a blessing rather than a hindrance to lifestyle. And you contrast that fertile single income family with the enlightened hedonist Western norm of the dinks couple, that is the dual income, no kids couple that wants to travel the world and orient their lives around professional success. Well, you're going to have diversity there, but you're certainly not going to have equality of outcome. You'll have a poorer, fecund, religious, brown family on the one side and a wealthy, barren, secular white family on the other, and you multiply that hundreds of millions of times across the entire country, and you get a lot of diversity, but you don't get anything close to equity. And so to summarize, while the West likes to flatter itself by thinking that our enlightened societies permit liberty, equality, and diversity, it's really more like liberty, equality, or diversity. Choose one. As a little interlude before turning to an important figure in the history of Christianity, and a theme we will visit again when we get to Tucker Carlson's wrestling with the nature of Christianity, I want to take a moment to visit a phrase that is scandalizing to a lot of lifestyle or cultural Christians who think that hate is somehow inherently sinful, and that if you're hating something, even something that's bad, even something that is wrong, that you're somehow inherently doing something wrong. But hate is an enormous part of the Christian worldview. because sin itself has to be hated. That is what Christians are called to do. To, as pithily as possible, summarize what Christians are called to do in the world, it is to love the sinner and hate the sin. We talked about that a few weeks ago, looking at Pontius Pilate and how his tolerance of something that he should have hated, which was an injustice done to a completely innocent man, that his tolerance of this sin, instead of hating it, as Christians are compelled to do, and so it was his tolerance that led him to go down in history in infamy as the person who greenlit the most horrific thing from a Christian perspective that has ever been permitted to happen. And parenthetically, the prince of this world doesn't even reward those who should hate his sin for instead displaying tolerance towards it. The context of that revisiting of the Pontius Pilate crucifixion story was how churchians today regard Pontius Pilate as a brutal tyrant who crucified Jesus. Enough bearing the lead, looking at Psalm 139, verses 20 through 24. This is from the New International Version. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord, and abhor those who are in rebellion against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. And that's been sanitized over time. The King James Version has verse 22 read, I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them my enemies. This is David, ancestor of Jesus, slayer of Goliath, singing praise and prayer to God to give him the strength and the fortitude to follow God's will, to express a perfect hatred against God's enemies and to characterize the enemy of God in a single word, it is sin. And if an apology for hatred in a Christian context wasn't taboo enough, and of course we're talking about a very specific, ordered hatred, not an indiscriminate hatred, not a bloodlust, not an unbalanced desire for vengeance or anything like that. But even just the idea that far from hate being inherently a problem, inherently sinful, that it is in fact something that Christians are compelled to do. If that wasn't controversial enough, taboo enough, we'll look now at a Christian who died nearly 5 centuries ago who understood that compulsion for Christian hatred better than the churchians today do. As for whether or not he understood Jewishness better or worse than modern churchians, I'll agnostically leave to the discernment of the listeners. Reading from the 65,000-word treatise written by Martin Luther in 1543 entitled On the Jews and Their Lies, and here, as in much of the book, he is talking about Jews, quote, in fact, they hold us Christians captive in our own country. They let us work in the sweat of our brow to earn money and property while they sit behind the stove, idle away the time, fart and roast pears. They stuff themselves, guzzle and live in luxury and ease from our hard-earned goods. With their accursed usury, they hold us and our property captive, unquote. And now, from the Epstein files, Jeffrey Epstein writing in October of 2009, quote, this is the way the Jew make money, and made a fortune in the past 10 years, selling short the shipping futures. Let the Goyim deal in the real world, unquote. Let's see if we can get even more controversial, and instead of just violating the taboo on the association between Jews and usury, looking at the association with something darker still. Again, from Martin Luther's writing, quote, therefore, the history books often accuse them of contaminating wells, of kidnapping and piercing children, as for example at Trent, Wyzensee, etc. They, of course, deny this. Whether it is true or not, I do know that they do not lack the complete, full, and ready will to do such things either secretly or openly where possible. This you can assuredly expect from them, and you must govern yourselves accordingly, unquote. The Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, was born trying to spring a convicted murderer, Leo Frank, who was convicted of raping and killing a 13-year-old Irish Catholic girl named Mary Fagan, from jail. Frank tried to pin it on a black janitor who worked at the pencil factory that he owned, but an all-white jury in the putatively irredeemably racist South completely exonerated the poor black man and instead fingered the rich white guy. I guess they want us to believe it was because he was Jewish, and the anti-Semitism of the Christian South in the days of the Ku Klux Klan was far more pronounced than the anti-black animus in the defeated Confederate South. And it's just their irrational desire to spin mendacity about blood libel, even if it means letting black men who rape and kill white girls off. That's what we're supposed to believe. That was the unanimous verdict of white jurors in the formerly Confederate, putatively racist South at the beginning of the 20th century. Who knows if the jurors even knew that Leo Frank was Jewish. They certainly knew that the person Leo Frank tried to finger, the janitor, was black. So to summarize, maybe what the powers that be today say about your ancestors are correct. But it could also be what your ancestors said about the powers that be today are correct. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but Globo Homo wants you to have exactly one position, and any deviation from that, any asking questions, any inquiry, any pushing back at the validity or the accuracy of the narrative is strictly forbidden. It is a taboo that obfuscates some amount of reality. Speaking of Christianity and conservatism and ancestry, Erick Erickson is a self-described Christian conservative radio host, longtime radio host, who was a never-Trumper a decade ago, and really for the last 8 or 9 years, and recently looking through his public posts, he has been celebrating the Trump administration and posting positively on things that Trump has done. Like many of the neocons who viscerally hated Trump and the MAGA movement a decade ago have now effectively come to commandeer it, and so the things that Trump criticized 10 years ago are now the things that he is giving power to in a way that makes it hard to escape the conclusion that far from beating the managerial state, Trump has become part of it. Anyhow, the especially taboo topic will dragoon Erick Erickson into helping us explore a post from last week. Erick Erickson wrote, "Some right-wingers on this hell site," he's talking about X, "insist we should only allow white people to immigrate to this country. And every day I see a bunch of white people cheering on this country's destruction at the hands of Iran, and I see a lot of non-white people and Jews standing with America." Wow, this country, the United States, is being destroyed by Iran. That's the assertion that Erick Erickson is making, that the problems besetting the United States of America today are because of Iran. Also, he talks about white people cheering on America's destruction while non-white people and Jews are standing with America. And so I guess in Erickson's conception, Jews are not non-whites. They are whites, but they're the good kind of whites. Whereas the bad kind of whites would be maybe Christian conservatives, white Christian conservatives, like what he calls himself. That's the absurdity. The more interesting thing, though, is the first sentence in this post. "Some right-wingers on this hell site insist we should only allow white people to immigrate to this country." Erickson doesn't need to agree with that, but it is the American conservative position in the truest sense of the term. One of the first pieces of legislation passed in the United States, in America, as a sovereign nation, just 6 months after the first legislative act of the United States of America, free and independent of England. So this is America conservatism at the most conservative, at the very beginning of the nation's existence as such, passed the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1790. Passed by the House of Representatives and the Senate, signed into law by George Washington, unanimously approved by all of the Founding Fathers, read, "Be it enacted that any alien, being a free white person, who shall have resided within the limits under the jurisdiction of the United States for the term of 2 years, may be admitted to become a citizen thereof. An application to any common law court of record in any one of the states wherein he shall have resided for the term of 1 year at least, and making proof to the satisfaction of such court that he is a person of good character, and taking the oath or affirmation prescribed by law to support the Constitution of the United States, which oath or affirmation such court shall administer, and the clerk of such court shall record such application and the proceedings therein, and thereupon such person shall be considered as a citizen of the United States. So that is American nationalism at its most conservative. At its core, something very inherently demographically conservative. And right-wing progressives like Erick Erickson, who call themselves conservative, will inevitably always be on the losing side of the moral equation because they step into the progressive frame and then position themselves as conservatives within the progressive framework. And so what that invariably leads to is a conservatism trailing progressivism by 5 or 10 years, increasingly by 6 months. And then once the progressive consensus has been reached, these so-called conservatives spend their time and energy attacking what used to be the conservative positions that self-described conservatives held. That is the role of people like Erick Erickson. It's stark, somewhat arresting to modern ears to hear this phenomenon looked at when it comes to demographic conservatism, because the progressive framing has been so effective over so long, over centuries now, generations and generations, such that what once was the dominantly held position among Americans now seems entirely foreign, almost like the past is a foreign country. But we can see how this process plays out if we look at same-sex marriage, which was something 25 years ago that was overwhelmingly opposed by everyone in America. Left, right, center, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, native-born, foreign-born, religious or not. And then the moral push was made, positions changed, progressives led the way, so-called conservatives followed suit, and now we have so-called conservatives like Erickson talking about how focusing on same-sex marriage, or as they would call it, gay marriage, is a silly and unimportant question. It's a settled thing, and we need to move past it and focus on more important things. As for more important things, well, more important things than Erick Erickson himself is Tucker Carlson. Turn now to Tucker Carlson's wrangling with Christianity and violence and the relationship between the two. In the past, we've critiqued Carlson for asserting that the destruction of entire societies is something that seems diametrically opposed to anything that has anything to do with Christianity. And while the rhetorical purpose is one that very much seems salutary from my perspective, that is to stop America's involvement in the Middle East and broadly and stop the destruction of civilians in Gaza and in Iran and Lebanon and Syria and all through the Levant. But though the rhetorical purpose is a laudatory one, scripturally and historically, with regards to the Christian faith, Tucker Carlson is entirely off base in making that assertion. And in the intervening time, he seems to have come to realize that, or maybe he always realized it and just didn't feel comfortable trying to contend with it publicly, but he is now doing so, as was on display in his conversation with the Catholic Bishop Strickland.
Also common, I think. People, as you said, who have power tend to misuse it, an often noted phenomenon because it's true. What's different, at least in my lifetime, is seeing self-described Christian leaders not only defend violence, but attack anyone who questions its use, and then use the Bible to justify it. So I guess what I'm saying is one of the battles here is over what Christianity is as a faith, and that seems to me a very important battle, certainly a conversation. So what you're seeing some Christian leaders do is say, well, there's violence throughout the Bible, and God justifies it, in some cases defends it through what the Christians call the Old Testament. From beginning to end, there's violence against innocents. So it's therefore okay. What is your response to that?
The bishop's response is Jesus Christ and a very gospel-centric understanding of the scriptures. We're wading into deep theological waters when we try to assess what is the most important part of the Bible. If the belief is it's all divinely inspired, it is the Word of God transcribed through men, then the admonition from John in the book of Revelations was the last thing written and the last thing in the chronologically presented Bible that Christians all over the world, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, use. There is the warning against adding or deleting anything to the books that come together to make Scripture what it is. On the other hand, Jesus Christ is the fulfillment of God's covenant with man. It is the culmination of the Christian story. And so in that sense, it can be justifiably and completely understandably referred to as the most important part of the Christian story, the Christian message, the Scriptures. But dismissing the rest of the divinely inspired Word of God, hand-waving it off as something that doesn't matter anymore, that has nothing to say to Christians today, no moral messages to impart, and in fact, if anything, it's backwards, and some will even insinuate, without explicitly saying so, that a lot of what happens prior to Christ's entry into the world is inherently bad, is sinful, as if God himself sinned in the past or changed the rules of what constituted sin in the past that no longer does so in the present. And that, from a Christian perspective, is at least as controversial as the reading of Scripture that Carlson and Strickland are criticizing here. It puts Ness here in a tough position because sentimentally I'm with Carlson and Strickland and what he is trying to do here. But intellectually, there's a lot that needs to be contended with and needs to be addressed. Jesus was named after Joshua. In the Hebrew, it's pronounced Yeshua, which translates into English as Joshua. It's come down to us as Jesus because that comes from a translation from the Hebrew Yeshua to a Greek translation, Yisush, is the best rendition this Teutonic tongue can give of the Hebraic translation into Greek, which then was translated from Greek into English as Jesus. But etymologically, Jesus is just another way of saying the name Joshua. And without the various language translations over time, we would refer to both Joshua in the Old Testament and Jesus in the New Testament with the same names. Who is Joshua? He succeeded Moses. He was, quite bluntly, a warlord. That's what Joshua was. Reading from Joshua 10, verses 28 through 42. Now Joshua captured Makkedah on that day, and struck it and its king with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed it, and every person who was in it. He left no survivor. Thus he did to the king of Makkedah, just as he had done to the king of Jericho. Then Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Makkedah to Libnah, and fought against Libnah. The Lord gave it also with its king into the hands of Israel, and he struck it, and every person who was in it with the edge of the sword. He left no survivor in it. Thus he did to its king, just as he had done to the king of Jericho. And Joshua and all of Israel with him passed on from Libnah to Lachish, and they camped by it and fought against it. The Lord gave Lachish into the hands of Israel, and he captured it on the second day, and struck it, and every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, according to all that he had done to Libnah. Then Horam, king of Gezer, came up to help Lachish, and Joshua defeated him and his people until he had left him no survivor. And Joshua and all Israel with him passed on from Lachish to Eglon, and they camped by it and fought against it. They captured it on that day and struck it with the edge of the sword. And he utterly destroyed that day every person who was in it, according to all that he had done to Lachish. Then Joshua and all Israel with him went up from Eglon to Hebron, and they fought against it. They captured it and struck it and its king and all its cities and all the persons who were in it with the edge of the sword. He left no survivor, according to all that he had done to Eglon. And he utterly destroyed it and every person who was in it. Then Joshua and all Israel with him returned to Debar, and they fought against it. He captured it and its king and all its cities, and they struck them with the edge of the sword, and utterly destroyed every person who was in it. He left no survivor. Just as he had done to Hebron, so he did to Debir and its king, as he had also done to Libnah and its king. Thus Joshua struck all the land, the hill country, and the Negev, and the lowland, and the slopes, and all their kings. He left no survivor, but he utterly destroyed all who breathe, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded. Joshua struck them from Kadesh Barnea even as far as Gaza, and all the country of Goshen even as far as Gibeon. Joshua captured all these kings and their lands at one time, because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel. It's harsh. It needs to be contended with. Don't despair. It doesn't mean that Christianity is exclusively or anything close to primarily a religion based on militarism and violence, conquest, genocide even, ethnic cleansing. The message, more broadly, Joshua comes first, and his warfare is a physical one. Jesus comes subsequently, and his war is the more important one, it is the spiritual war. But that is not to say, of course, that Jesus was a pacifist. One of the last things he's recorded to do in the Gospels before being crucified is flipping over the money changers' tables, fastening a whip, and going to town on the clerical class at the time, violently whipping them and drawing their blood. And of course, Revelations comes after the Gospels. It is spectacularly violent. The end times imagery in Revelations informs so much of what the modern conception of the apocalypse and end times are. Look, not surprisingly, a religious tradition that has occupied some of the greatest minds the world has ever produced over 3,000 years turns out to be a little more nuanced than violence good or violence bad. It is, as the pretentious types like to say, a lot more nuanced than that. I wish that being MAGA was a little more nuanced than it actually is, because it is, like the Tea Party before it, effectively something that may have had real philosophical underpinnings when it was inchoate, when it was contending with the ruling structure of the Republican Party at the time. But that's no longer the case. It is a slogan that has been adopted, and it is one that is worn most ostentatiously by those who are the most devoted partisans of the Republican establishment today. The term has been drained of its initial meaning and has been repurposed as a rhetorical device to be wielded by the very system that it was originally employed to combat. And we see that starkly on display with an Economist YouGov poll this week asking, quote, "Do you support or oppose the war with Iran?" unquote. Overall support is 28%, opposition 59%. This is not a popular war. Among Republicans, though, there is a majority that support it by more than 2-1. 62% of Republicans support it compared to 24% who oppose it. The number for Democrats is 4% support, 88% opposition. Independents, 19% support, and 63% opposition. But among those who self-identify as MAGA members, as those who are behind making America great again, 75% of them support it, just 10% oppose it. So the net support among Republicans is plus 38%. The net support among self-identified MAGA members is plus 65%. So those who identify as MAGA are twice as likely as Republicans as a whole to support the war in Iran. So far from representing some America First focused ending of military adventurism, MAGA is instead the military adventurism of the George W. Bush era Republican Party a generation ago reincarnate, or more accurately, rebranded. I mean, that's a little bit depressive. And so in an attempt to elevate my mood a little, I will recount a thought that occurred to me earlier this week. I'm an avid biker, and as I was biking, I thought to myself, it is true that while biking, I spend most of my time riding uphill, most of my time riding against the wind. And I don't mean that in a flippant, back in my day, we had to walk uphill against the wind in the snow both ways 5 miles to get to school. I mean it very literally, because I don't bike as fast when I'm biking uphill as I do when I'm going downhill, and I don't bike as fast when I'm riding into the wind as I do when I have the wind at my back. The distance is the same, of course, going uphill and downhill and going with the wind and going against the wind, but the time spent is not. And that's something to stoically steel yourself with, understanding that, grasping it, facing it. Mindset matters, and we benefit from being able to turn pressure into power and turn stress into strength. One thing in the discussion Jeff and I had last week about IQ that I forgot to mention was an objection to the utility, and it's really a rhetorical objection. It is not a meaningful objection, as we'll get to in a second, that there are greater differences within groups in terms of measured intelligence than there are between them, and therefore intelligence tells us nothing about human populations. And why I say it is rhetorically true but intentionally misleading is because, in fact, it is, strictly speaking, accurate. If the average IQ of East Asians is 105 and the average IQ of whites is 100, well, that's a difference of just 5 points in terms of the difference between the two averages for the two groups. And of course, there is a wider difference among individual whites and individual East Asians than just 5 points. There are whites with an IQ of 70. There are whites with an IQ of 130. There are East Asians with an IQ of 70. There are East Asians with an IQ of 130. There's a gap of 60 points that is 12 times wider than the gap between the white average and the East Asian average. But the rhetorical trick is to, because of that obvious truth, to insinuate that therefore the difference between the white and East Asian average doesn't matter. We could think about two basketball teams where the average height of Team A is 7 feet and the average height of Team B is 6 feet, so a foot difference between the two. But we'll say that Team A has a point guard who is 6 feet tall and a center who is 8 feet tall. And also that the Team B has a center who is 6'8" and a point guard who is 5'6". So in both the case of Team A, there's a variation of 2 feet between the tallest and the shortest. In Team B, there's a variation of 14 inches between the two. And so in both cases, we have more variation in height between the two teams than we do between the averages of the two teams. But it would be absurd to conclude from that it doesn't matter that Team A has an average height of 7 feet tall and Team B has an average height of 6 feet tall, and that will tell us nothing about how the game is likely to turn out. A recurring observation here is how the mainstream populist right now sounds virtually indistinguishable from the dissident or so-called alt-right of a decade or two ago. In an episode this week, the Daily Wire's Matt Walsh did an opening extended segment about how white Boston was 70 years ago. American Renaissance, which the Daily Wire, along with every other populist right, along with corporate rights, media organization and institution of good standing, called deplorable and bigoted and horrible names and can never be taken seriously and should be totally expelled from any legitimate discourse. American Renaissance has had a series of documenting the demographic transition of major U.S. cities, what they've undergone over the last century. And Boston fits perfectly into that series. It fits just right. The only difference is that American Renaissance, or the dissident right, said we need a self-confident white majority to have these things again, while Matt Walsh says it's impossible not to notice that since we lost the self-confident white majority, we've lost these things too. Though it is worth noting one thing Walsh and the populist right more generally is more confident in than the dissident right was or is that the populist right is unapologetically Christian. Superficially, Churchians argue that open borders is a Christian compulsion, but the empirical reality is exactly the opposite. It was an unapologetically Christian nation that passed the Immigration Act of 1924 that massively restricted immigration, put quotas on immigration from places all over the world, with the exception of Latin America, as we mentioned in a previous recording. And it was the Civil Rights Revolution that led to the passing of the 1965 Open Borders Immigration Act that came on the heels of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The restrictionist America of the 1920s was a lot more Christian than the open borders America of the 1960s. And today, Christians are far more restrictionist than any other religion is, and way more restrictionist than atheists are. Self-described atheists and agnostics are the only groups that are majority open borders when the question's put to them. Additionally, the more pious, that is, the more likely to attend church services and say religion is important to them, a Christian is, the more restrictionist they tend to be. And so in a figure like Matt Walsh, we see the fusionism of American conservatism and Christian nationalism and white nationalism and maybe Christian white nationalism coming together. One thing that fusionist movement, however it manifests, will have to contend with is Donald Trump and what the legacy of the 45th and 47th President of the United States is going to be, reading from the famous, now infamous, Truth on Easter morning, Trump writing, "Tuesday will be Power Plant Day and Bridge Day, all wrapped up in one in Iran. There will be nothing like it. Open the effing straight, you crazy bastards, or you'll be living in hell. Just watch. Praise be to Allah." Despite being called a vulgarian, Trump doesn't use vulgarity in public that often. The F-bomb is out of character here. It's outside the boundaries that he normally sets for himself, and boasting about war crimes. The signal here, or the signal was pre-nuclear. What he was trying to show is that he had crossed all the boundaries of etiquette in social media now with this post, and so by extension he's ready to cross all the boundaries of the perceived 21st century rules of war. Since that thing went out, there has apparently been some sort of de-escalation, or at least the kicking the can down the road a couple of weeks. A tenuous ceasefire between the United States and Iran that Israel doesn't seem to be a party to, as Israel continues to obliterate southern Lebanon. But even though we can collectively breathe a sigh of relief that Trump tacoed out again, it was enough for Tucker Carlson to really make a clean break, snap, and disassociate himself from Trump entirely. And that is something observers have noted for the better part of the last year, how even as Trump goes after Tucker Carlson, who is the most prominent and influential figure on the popular right in opposition to what MAGA has become and what the Trump administration is doing, despite that, publicly, Carlson has bent over backwards not to attack Trump personally, not to criticize Trump, and to attribute the imprudent actions the Trump administration has taken to other members who are surrounding him and giving him bad advice. But that changed this week when Carlson released a multiple hour-long recording where he did the "How dare you, Mr. President? What you said is evil, unforgivable, irredeemable." Politically, this is interesting because if we look at Polymarket, the odds for the Republican presidential nomination are J.D. Vance number 1, Marco Rubio number 2, and Tucker Carlson now moving up in the number 3 spot. If the war against Iran really goes south, it is difficult to see how Vance or Rubio survive that politically intact. The markets also right now predict a more than 40-seat majority for Democrats in the House after the midterm elections, and now Democrats are also projected, at least in terms of the smart money in the betting markets, to win back the Senate and hold 52 of the 100 seats in the Senate. And with the price of oil in the triple digits, an accelerated rise in other consumer prices, colloquially referred to as inflation, but I'm going to be annoyingly autistic there and state again that is not actually what inflation is. But because virtually everything that is consumed in the modern world has energy, has oil as an input in the cost, as the price of oil is elevated, continues to go up, and stays elevated, it is going to lead to acute price increases across the economy. And so how in that environment, important members of the second Trump administration, how they are going to realistically be able to come out of that politically intact and vie for the 2028 presidential nomination is tough to make sense of. It certainly seems like there will be an opportunity for someone on the right not associated with the second Trump administration to make a serious run. And Tucker Carlson might be that man. I'll end on a happy note. My son asked about Artemis, the second Artemis mission earlier this week. He asked with a gearhead's excitement about it. I was embarrassed a little bit to be somewhat out of the loop. I've boned up since. And last night, the mission to send people the farthest they've ever been from Earth in space returned successfully. All 4 astronauts made it back in one piece, and humanity achieved an act of greatness surpassing what had ever come before. And that is a testament to how, despite the challenges, the problems, the contradictions, the obstacles, a few of which we discussed today, that is a testament to how, despite all of those things, there is an indomitable human spirit that just is not extinguished so easily. And seeing that expressed in the curiosity and excitement and awe of my posterity was a wonderful thing to have happened. That'll do it for this week. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.